Time is out of joint. This line from Hamlet would be frequently examined by philosopher Derrida in The Spectres of Marx when creating a reference for hauntology. Hauntology is a portmanteau of haunting and ontology, so in short, the examination of things that haunt our beings. Hauntology was Derrida's framing device of examining Marx's writing in the 20th century. Hauntology is the lingering of the past in the present, or what we can now call lost futures. The concept of lost futures when discussing the internet, pop culture, and our contemporaneous 21st century life has been dominated by specters of our past. More importantly, our longing for that past. Late contemporary thinker Mark Fisher describes this phenomenon as current life speeding up, but current culture slowing down, and theorizes that culture keeps recounting the past as a call for comfort in a wholly capital-driven world. There is a pervading sense of melancholy for the past. Our current political and economic climate makes it difficult for culture to push through to new frontiers. An example of hauntology that is easily observable is contemporary popular music, and one such situation that I find particularly poignant is The Weeknd's Blinding Lights. Blinding Lights echoes the 1980s new wave and synth pop ethos, copying its aesthetic down to its anachronistic synth font. It's not surprising that the lyrical content seems to reflect a longing for someone, which is connoted by the singing of the chorus over an eerily cheerful melody. The 1980s aesthetic that pervades this track calls for a time that we cannot return to, but ultimately still lingers. Mark Fisher envisions contemporary culture being a carcass that has been pasteurized, delaying its decay even further. If I were to expand more on Fisher's position on pop culture and capitalist realism, this video would be padded out exponentially. Fisher's outlook was bleak to say the least, and his work would only become more resonant with his tragic suicide in 2017. Our pessimism for the future only fuels our addiction to nostalgia. It's why so much of our art is derivative of the past. With this established framework, hauntology starts to become more evident when looking through creepypasta over the past decade. Many of the now famous or infamous stories contain such a strong amount of nostalgia, whether it's for 1980s culture or even a digital past. However, creepypasta has an underlying contempt for the nostalgia it uses. Horror has always been a unique vehicle for discourse. Many characters or elements become host to unique metaphors and symbols that can violently change our perception of the world. The internet has, for better or worse, delivered information with such immediacy that it has transformed how we think and perceive information. This explosion of communication and information mutated how we could tell stories so drastically that sometimes the medium itself became part of the story. Creepypasta can be easily thought of as campfire stories, now in a digital form. To properly emulate this intimacy, scary stories needed to adapt themselves to the age of the internet. Even though the medium of creepypasta was new and exciting, the carcass of culture and the lost futures created by it, put forth by Fisher, echo the same cultural texture. These stories are marred by specters of the past. Another interesting perspective related to hauntology and creepypastas are the haunted video games microgenre. Creepypastas about early Pokemon games like Red, Blue, and Super Mario 64 are constructed from the memories of players that found parts of the games eerie. The limitations of the hardware for both games often yielded unsettling results. The song for Lavender Town is a harrowing tune which was rewritten in gaming history as something uniquely sinister. The story of Lavender Town syndrome implies that binaural beats were encoded into the song itself, causing discomfort and other psychological effects. The story was intended to provoke and bring out lingering feelings of uneasiness when remembering a fond gaming memory. A perception of that song and area in Pokemon Red and Blue has forever been recontextualized by the spread of that creepypasta. Lavender Town's uneasy melody returned as a specter in the form of an internet story. As recent as 2020, we've seen Super Mario 64 make its rounds back in the form of alternative reality games and the iceberg trend. Every copy is personalized is a perfect example of hauntology. This tiny phrase evoked memories of people's first time with Super Mario 64. While we can empirically prove that no copy of Super Mario 64 is personalized, people believe this phrase evoked hidden feelings of uneasiness about the game that they had. Their memories of Super Mario 64 were tainted, for a lack of a better word, with the ideations of catered experience. People started reminiscing about how empty and creepy Mario 64 felt, how it gave them feelings of unease while playing. Some argued these feelings about their memories were just recontextualized by these recent trends. However, the loneliness in Super Mario 64 was just a byproduct of hardware limitations. Populating Super Mario 64 with more NPCs was a pipe dream. It's been proven that the code was quite sloppy due to how Nintendo handled making their early Nintendo 64 games. Even then, this feeling of loneliness in the game has been talked about way before recent hauntings of our memories. Games that came after Super Mario 64 made us reconsider how we look at the game to begin with, and as such, a new way to spike fear and unease into our perception of the game. With these examples in mind, creepypastas beckon our deep cultural memories by either recontextualizing them as short internet fiction or some type of alternative reality psychological game. Teddy is the all-too-familiar story trope of a haunted doll or plush toy. The pasta attempts to deconstruct childhood innocence, transforming the childlike comfort of a teddy bear into a deformed, unfeeling, homicidal entity. Teddy bears, dolls, and plush toys are comforting and, most of the time, designed to look friendly or, at the very least, not terrifying like this teddy bear. What's more is that many children anthropomorphize their teddy bears. A name or characteristics they ascribe to it makes it less of an inanimate object and more of a quiet friend that's always there. Capsizing this dynamic is effective. Giving a teddy bear who evokes an uncanny valley feeling, or having the object harbor malign intentions, strips away that childhood innocence that's supposed to be embedded in these objects. The concept of your teddy bear or toy coming alive to cause distress, or at the very worst, physical harm, isn't just scary because of its paranormal implications, but because of how it strips away the childlike innocence that is embedded in these objects. The teddy bear in this pasta is literally haunting the main character. It follows the main character from childhood all the way until adulthood, where it tries to kill the main character in the end. This specter from childhood is an example of trauma as a haunting. Recollections of the past with the teddy bear are influenced by the climax and the end of the story. There is doubt that could be placed upon the narrator for false memories in this childhood, as our memories are not objective. The present is the future, and the future are the specters of the past. The narrator is right to think that the bear is creepy and sinister, but they, no matter the circumstances, are influenced by this nostalgia. Another hauntological aspect of this creepypasta isn't the story itself, but how our memories influence our perception of it. As I discussed previously, time hasn't been generous to the creepypasta. Examining this pasta for its literary techniques and general writing quality, it falls short of even a low bar of quality set by the other entries in this video. However, the cliches applied make it way less interesting, like the teddy being at the end of the bed, or the teddy miraculously showing up in a different location entirely. I chose to talk about this pasta in particular as it's garnered millions of views on YouTube from many different readers and voiceovers. However, I'm willing to bet no one remembers this pasta for its actual writing and only remembers the image associated with it. Hauntology can be about lost futures. The opportunities, what-ifs, or even regrets are futures we will never see. This is going to be a tiny bit of a tangent, and bear with me. This pasta falls victim to the same missed opportunity the film Child's Play does. It forgoes the sense of mystery and completely disregards the misdirection the story uses to make it creepy and unnerving. My ideal version of the film would be one where the doubt of Andy's claims of Chucky being alive are positions both the character in the narrative and audience are firmly cemented, only for Chucky to be alive at the very end of the film. While both Teddy and Chucky are creepy, the stage for them to truly be frightening are stripped away by the truth being revealed way too early. Child's Play and Teddy are similar in that they jump the shark by having really bad pacing. These pasts, presents, and futures only live in our minds as ghosts of what could have been. Simply put, Teddy just had the misfortune of being so derivative that any meaning that can be derived from it would be pulling at straws. In short, it sucks. Mr. Mix is another forgettable and derivative pasta. Instead of examining the stories and deconstructing its cultural origin, I want to examine the recyclable nature of creepypasta itself, and the ghosts that start to overlap this genre. Mr. Mix is a story about a fictitious 90s PC typing game. In this game, you type words to communicate what the titular Mr. Mix mixes in his bowl. The game has some unbelievably obtuse elements like background music being random growls or an ominous high-pitched noise. Like clockwork, the people who played this game would experience intense nightmares. Data miners would find disturbing images deep within the game's files that can't be deleted and would refuse to talk about their experience with the locked content in the game. They would later go missing after experiencing intense feelings of paranoia. The story would conclude with one of the data miners trying to kidnap a child, claiming that they were Mr. Mix. It's no surprise that Creepypasta would become a pastiche of itself. Anyone can write these creepypastas and post them anonymously. Creepypasta's popularity in the late 2000s and the absence of quality control only meant that anyone can write a story, even if it's just a cocktail of overused elements such as a sudden onslaught of mental illness incurred by a wrathful piece of software that can only run on Windows 95. The over-reliance on these tropes only accelerated Creepypasta's descent into parody and ridicule. The immediacy of the internet meant the life cycles and sustainability of these stories as cultural fixtures meant that they would eventually become ghosts of themselves. Mr. Mix represents all the elements of lost media, haunted media, and hysteria-type creepypastas distilled into one horribly mediocre package. Its attempts to shock with all these tropes makes me think that creepypasta has also become a decaying corpse that needed to be desperately preserved. I can call to mind several examples, and some of these are in these videos, that did this way better before. But this is just one in several examples where creepypasta has become a specter itself. Let's look outside of video games for a minute and look at arguably the most popular creepypasta character, Slenderman. Slenderman serves as the quintessential example of analog media haunting our digital world. Slenderman's conception was entirely about the haunting of old pictures, evident by its place of origin, something awful's create paranormal images thread. Old, manipulated photographs are used for the medium of horror frequently to remind us of the time past and our inability to see what might have been lurking around in front of us the entire time. The adoption of retro aesthetics, especially used in art to evoke hauntology, often allowed more interactive forms of storytelling. From the perspective of a spectator, having seemingly innocuous photographs turn sinister once you notice an incomprehensible shape lurking in the background evokes a specific feeling of fear, one of frantic speculation. It makes you wonder, was this tall figure always around? The form of story in which Slenderman took off was based on this premise. Anyone can take these few images and create a spooky story out of them. Slenderman's fiction and this form of media pervaded reality in many ways. The internet allowed for more real-life content like this, such as photos of someone right before their death and other true crime-related photographs. Remnants of something's existence, especially terrifying if never to be found again, is a concept that shakes us to the bone. Even though Slenderman is an arguably fiction, we find ourselves reevaluating the past, even if we didn't live in whatever time a photo or image was taken. Like the act of adding salt to any dish to add flavor, the memories of an image can evoke a place and time, which in turn become laden with sinister or uncomfortable thoughts. The corruption of our cultural memory of this time and place is what amplifies the horror of these images. Even outside these doctored original images of Slenderman, the internet created a mythos around the character, allowing the character to pervade the unstable minds of two young girls, enough so to enact a heinous crime which almost had deadly consequences. The two young girls were mentally unstable enough to see and act out the will of a fictional apparition. It's bizarre to think that something so flagrantly fictional would have real-world consequences. But here we are. With hauntology in perspective, the ubiquity of Slenderman manifested itself in the fragile minds of these two young girls, like how Hamlet saw the specter of his father and drove both examples to madness. I hope that's not in poor taste, but it illustrates the potency of hauntology in the digital age. The origin and fiction of Slenderman became totally irrelevant in 2014 when that tragedy happened, and the hyper-reality of the internet became very, very transparent. Normalpornfornormalpeople.com is where hauntology almost exclusively engages with the digital age. This creepypasta has been lost to time and is a product of the era, but it's a great example of hauntology in the internet. This pasta is also somewhat prophetic, as it predicted our innate fears about the deep and dark web way before its mainstream attention. The story chronicles the experience of an internet denizen that goes over his experience of the eponymous website. The narrator navigates through the poorly designed website, only to end up finding an assortment of video files that are mostly absurd but are sinister underneath. It isn't until the narrator encounters the last video, useless.avi, where he witnesses a woman mauled to death by a chimp. While creepypastas often attempt to dramatize the events for the sake of storytelling, this creepypasta is so blunt in its presentation. It's just the account of someone's experience with the website with no pretense. The final sentences of the pasta read more like a historical account. The only proof that normalpornfornormalpeople.com ever existed was a few screen caps people took, and videos from the site that people saved and uploaded on torrents, the most popular of which being useless.avi, which found its way onto a few gore sites. Wherever you upload them to, all the videos from normalpornfornormalpeople.com get deleted after a while. While this is obviously fiction, our inability to totally disprove it lets us relive the memories of charting unexplored territory on the internet. All of us, to varying degrees, have encountered content on the internet that makes our stomach churn. The narrator of this story found files with sinister content. The ability to copy and proliferate a video file around the internet is enough to create an urban legend. While the names of the files and story are debatably fiction, the awful possibility of something like it existing is 100%. Our exploration and understanding of the dark web confirms this. Illegal materials are distributed on the deep web, which are 100 times worse than what's described here in the story. Hauntologically, the remnants of finding analog media like VHS rear their ugly head again. Finding a blank or a white labeled tape with one word is a perfect analog to finding an unknown video file somewhere on the web. The constant that never changed is our curiosity to find out what's inside. However, the digital age can conceal more than analog media ever could. The proliferation of media on the internet is infinitely faster than tape trading, meaning that old media can also be just as proliferated. Even though new technologies make it easier for media to be spread, what we find on the internet can be recursive. Jeff the Killer is the origin story of a psychopathic murderer. Its unoriginality doesn't lend itself nicely to the story, but the medium it's told in sure does, allowing for a very interesting examination of its hauntology. Setting aside the context of the image, which is ambiguous in origin and has been debated with the truth still far out of reach, Jeff the Killer is just a callback to 80s slasher and horror villains, just with a slight hint of anonymousness. That's not even a word. Fuck it. While the image itself is scary, it isn't too far off from what we see from horror designs. In fact, I can argue that it's just a poorly photoshopped knockoff
Ghost face.
Jeff the Killer evokes our deep cultural memory of horror from that time, but with an added sense of interactability. You can copy and paste the story anywhere, and anyone can read it in any format. You can't do that with Halloween or Friday the 13th. You have to either get a VHS copy or a DVD or, illegally distribute it. With creepypastas in general, the medium is the message. While engaging with the text, we all must suspend our disbelief to truly enjoy and immerse ourselves with the medium. Even though 80s horror was fiction, our enjoyment came from being scared by the monsters that were constructed on the silver screen. Jeff the Killer functions the same way fundamentally, but in the theater of the mind. His design and origin story are subtly wrapped up in 80s horror ephemera, and I'm certain I'm not the only one that's come to this conclusion, but that must be due to how time has treated the story and image. This isn't really scary anymore. There's a sense of cheesiness and lack of true craftsmanship that is unlike Smile Dog to Jeff that makes you wonder if there was a lost future where Jeff the Killer and Freddy Krueger were swapped. Smile Dog and Jeff the Killer are from the same era, but one persisted past the questionable nomenclature. Smile.jpg is an analog to the anxiety brought upon by the advent of the internet's omnipotence in our daily lives, and the influence it has over every little thing we do. Spread the word is effectively the internet's influence pervading us. The broader influence of the internet is hard to comprehend. We can speculate how greatly the internet has changed our lives, but it has become so rapidly influential that it almost supersedes us or logic itself. Its omnipresence and its contribution to surveillance makes it even more terrifying. In that sense, Smile Dog may also be an analog to something more sinister. Smile Dog is the internet's sinister side manifested. Creepypasta, whether as a necessity for its horror to be effective, had adopted an overwhelming sense of nihilism. Nothing is more evident of this characteristic than in Rugrats Theory, perhaps the most cynical, mean-spirited, and nihilistic creepypasta I have ever read for this collection of essays. Rugrats was an animated children's cartoon produced by Klasky Csupo in the late 90s. It's been regarded as one of the main pillars of programming for Nickelodeon in the late 90s, well before the media juggernaut that SpongeBob would turn that network into. It featured a cast of infants having extravagant adventures. Of course, these scenarios in the show would just be abstractions of a more realistic event an infant would experience. Of course, Creepypasta takes the childhood innocence that Rugrats provides and wipes it away with something sinister. Usually, creepypastas ease you into this with a positive and rose-tinted recollection of the piece of media they're covering. Rugrats Theory is as clinical as it is nihilistic. The Rugrats were really just a figment of Angelica's imagination, followed by vivid accounts of the kids in the show befalling some type of fate, and the subsequent effects it would have on the parents. It goes to some extremes, like Angelica being a schizophrenic and bipolar crack baby who needed to do acid to interact with the cast as a figment of her imagination. It would go even further, going as far as to have Chucky's dad marry a prostitute. Even worse, the writer has Angelica die of an overdose at age 13. Suffice it to say, it's extremely edgy. I don't see the need to go over any more of the theory here. It's a pretty short read. Personally, it's laughable how horribly mean-spirited this story is. I think it further illustrates some of Mark Fisher's point about our longing and melancholy for a lost future. Crafting a theory for an innocuous piece of children's media to be something this nihilistic is reflective of our need to revisit the past. It recalls how we look at our childhood with either fondness or contempt, and in this case, extreme contempt. Rugrats was a show about children exploring and developing. Stripping away that innocence can be shocking to some, especially if the reader has intense nostalgia for that property. Creepypasta was effective at showing the ghosts of our past and recontextualizing them in a way that made us uncomfortable. Dousing familiar properties in angst and nihilism only reminds us of the carcass that is culture currently. It's still decaying, and we refuse to push culture further. Analog horror's prevalence in the last year, due to channels like Mandela Catalog, give credence to Mark Fisher's interpretations and theories of hauntology. Analog horror represents a time we cannot return to. There's a reason it's often used as a found footage device. The internet's fascination with analog horror, and more importantly, obsolete forms of recording media, is curious. It's not something we can authentically recreate. Sure, we can film videos on a VHS camera, but we no longer do tape sharing or engage with the medium in its rawest form. Our fascination with the lo-fi aesthetic and the purposeful obscuring of details in analog horror recontextualizes our use of the medium. Excluding Slenderman or Jeff the Killer, Candle Cove is one of the few creepypastas to infiltrate mainstream culture. It was adapted in the television horror anthology series Channel Zero, albeit to middling reviews. Candle Cove is ostensibly about analog horror, or rather memories of someone experiencing analog horror. What's hauntological about Candle Cove specifically is that it conjures ghosts of two pasts, the analog and the digital. Candle Cove was written at the tail end of forum's prevalence on the web. The story centers around several people on a forum recounting their memories of the titular fictitious show, detailing disturbing elements that traumatized them as kids. The twist? It was all in their head. The kids' eyes were latched to static the entire time. The medium of the story is told through forum posts, which was a unique storytelling format, but it easily dates the story. Hauntologically, the forums as a storytelling medium as a way of retelling analog memories illustrates our deep fascination with the past, regardless of a pre- or post-internet. Using forums to describe memories of analog media adds its own layer of irony. For me personally, forums have come to represent a more organized and communal-focused social hub. It comes from a time where social media communication wasn't influenced by engagement. Forums were slightly more autonomous than social media today. Ideas communicated in a forum post were linearly represented. There were no retweets or upvotes to organize its visibility. It would be interesting to see a story like this reimagined for something like Twitter or Facebook. The lost futures aspect of Candle Cove is where its horror truly becomes evident. The story literally ends with false memories. The traumatic memories were conjured by imaginations of children. Keep in mind that the fictional show took place in the early 70s. The medium of television was still being developed. The wonder of images being transmitted to a box in your living room instantly was exciting. Even though Candle Cove wasn't real in the fiction, if you ask somebody over the age of 50 right now to recall their memories of their favorite show from their youth, they're likely to describe the show in a way that isn't true to its source. Nostalgia always paints a rosier picture of a memory. My father used to emphatically describe the quality of Clutch Cargo, a show with limited animation. So limited, in fact, that they transposed footage of mouths as a cost-cutting measure. This creepypasta can be interpreted as a criticism of nostalgia itself. Our memories and nostalgia for things in the past aren't always true to their actual quality. In the case of Candle Cove, sometimes the enemy was our mind all along. Nihilism is often the main ingredient used in creepypasta. Yes, the pun is intended. For Sonic.exe, nihilism is as represented as dough is on a pizza. The entire foundation of this creepypasta is that Sonic is now just an evil demon hedgehog in your computer. Like many other creepypastas, taking the familiar child comfort character and turning it sinister is the most common trope. Sonic.exe is the most notorious example of the excess of nihilism in creepypasta. In retrospect, Sonic the Hedgehog is the perfect choice for a creepypasta reimagining. The different iterations of Sonic the Hedgehog distinctly represent each time period he was in. The classic era represented the 90s attitude. The 3D era in the late 90s and 2000s represented cool in a sleek, quasi-futuristic urban aesthetic type of way. And modern Sonic, at least in his design, has been distilled down to something that can be easily applied to any format Sega needs him to be in. Sonic is also the perfect example of the pop culture media being cynical and recursive. We keep rehashing and reiterating in a cycle. Due to Sonic's undying fandom, this creepypasta became infamous, being endlessly brought up inside and outside of creepypasta. Sonic himself, at least in the pop culture landscape, is not too dissimilar to how the creepypasta portrays him. Sonic has become a pastiche of himself. His design is only reflective of what works contemporaneously. The sinister nature of Sonic.exe's character isn't just to be malevolent, but a sly reflection of his cultural perception. This perception, like his character, is just as malleable. Sonic as a franchise has been reassessed retroactively over the past few years in a popular conscience, now being looked at more critically. Antiquated game design, transparently bad character designs and stories, and short-sighted decision-making from Sega have tainted the Blue Blur's image. Sonic.exe amplifies this bad image not out of resentment for Sonic, but because of Sonic himself. Mario creepypastas, for the most part, never usually paint Mario as a malevolent, eldritch beast that infects your computer and tries to kill you. In fact, Mario is often empathized with in the fiction of creepypastas, usually being the victim of something sinister within a story. It takes less legwork for the audience to empathize with Mario because of how absolutely concrete his perception is. Mario is absolutely timeless. This is why he hasn't needed a redesign. The games have, for the most part, remained critically beloved. Mario hasn't changed much in the past 40 years because he didn't need to. It was always a winning formula. Sonic being a sinister spirit haunting a video game is immediately believable. You can apply nihilism to Sonic because of how malleable he's always been, for better or for worse. Whether or not the original author intended it, this creepypasta perfectly represents the state of this series. This Sonic was a monster, a pure evil, sadistic, all-powerful, nightmarish, demented monster. Of all of his victims, including Tails, Knuckles, Robotnik, and possibly Kyle, are just his little toys. And the game is the very gateway into his chaotic, nightmarish world, and the very hell his victims are trapped in. Sonic and its fans have been trapped in the cycle of nostalgia. Sonic.exe, in the fiction and in reality, represent a ghost haunting our memories of the character. Reducing the Blue Blur with attitude to a digital vessel for God, only to haunt the main character, can be analogous to his perception of the character in the fandom and the wider culture. Nostalgia, especially for Sonic.exe, is the true antagonist. Hey, that's the end of the video, and this is my cat into the frame here last minute, so I had to like set up a new shot and everything. So I hope you enjoy my cat. I hope you enjoy Dustry right there. If you like the video, please leave a like. I know this is really far into the video. This is the end of the video, so there's a chance that nobody's watching it at this point. But if you are, leave me a comment saying that you watched the whole video. I don't know what the plan is for like next year in this type of content for like Hauntology and Creepypasta. I'm not going to make this like an annual thing. But I think next year I'm either going to do an open invite to have people come and like write essays and then have them voiced and like put a giant like collaboration together, or I'm just going to publish my own book. And I'm thinking the latter because it'd be cool to do that, and it's something I've been meaning to do for a while. It's something I certainly want to do before I'm 30 anyway. So I think it's a good excuse to just kind of maybe go through like most creepypastas and just write an obnoxious amount about creepypasta, hauntology, philosophy, its cultural origin, stuff like that. But this video was a just mountain of effort for research and like writing purposes and like theorizing, so please do give it a like, and I hope you enjoyed it. And here's just my rest. This is me. I'm going on a little bit of a writing break. I'm probably not going to put a video out for the next like 2 weeks. We'll see. If anything, it'll be like the third Monday of November. We'll see, because a lot of stuff is just getting prepared for Flash December. So I'm gonna rest till then, but not really. I'm gonna be writing. So bye.